Welcome back to the Horror Highway. As you can see, I did the North Dakota Iceberg. Now, there was a slight mix-up. I was supposed to be doing the North Carolina one. I kinda messed up and somehow ended up doing the North Dakota one completely before realizing I did the wrong state. My mistake. But I finished it. So, anyways, I'm gonna hop on that North Carolina one as soon as this one's done. So, you can look forward to that. This one's smaller than the other ones I've done. There's not too much in North Dakota. Hopefully what I did get was good. I think it's decent. Anyways, there's the iceberg, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Also, my bad for certain bits. My voice got pretty hoarse. Some recordings are pretty rough. It's not too bad, it's just at certain points my voice gets a bit too soft, more soft than usual, so it might be a little hard to hear, but you always just put the volume up a tiny bit. Tier 1. In the Minot Air Force Base, Pot Sasquatch. Now, usually when it comes to cryptids, obviously the main source of information comes from stories, and from time to time you'll find ones that are debunked but are still kind of like famous within the state/town they're from, and it's the case for this one. The Pot Sasquatch is a Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, that began existing in October 2018, mainly because around that time Canada had legalized marijuana, and since the Minot Air Force Base is close to the border of Canada, the leadership within the Air Force Base made up this sort of like cryptid that would be able to tell if you had smoked pot or not. They basically went around telling the crewmen of the Air Force Base that, yeah, if you smoked pot, this Sasquatch is gonna come out, sniff you out, and because it makes all this big noise and everything, we're gonna find out that you ended up smoking, which, they're not allowed to do while on the job. It was basically a way for those in leadership to tell those, hey, remember, if you get caught smoking, having marijuana in your system, you're gonna get fired. Just to scare the people who worked in the Minot Air Force Base. The Miniwashitu. Coming from the local indigenous tribe of the Mandan comes the story of the Miniwashitu, a red-haired buffalo-like creature with only one eye in its forehead, and on its back, a very large jagged backbone. Supposedly, the Miniwashitu only comes by after the river is frozen and uses its huge backbone to break the icy river in which it lives by, that being the Missouri River. It's been described as extremely aggressive, and usually before being sighted, it could be heard screaming or horrifying howl. It's been spotted by the Mandan both at night and during the day. When spotted at night, it's described as a flame over the river, breaking the frozen river, and when seen during the day, it supposedly brings badness to whoever has witnessed it, then shortly thereafter, death. Not much more is known about the Miniwashitu, mainly because the Mandan population had been utterly decimated by smallpox, only leaving that little amount of information that we know about the cryptid. The Takuhi. While a lot of sightings of the Takuhi come from South Dakota, and the name itself comes from the Lakota language and the Lakota tribe, which is mainly located in South Dakota, there have been sightings of the Takuhi in North Dakota. Mainly a lot of sightings around 1977 near the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. Now, a brief description of the Takuhi would have it seem to be like a normal Bigfoot, a 7 to 9 foot tall creature, completely covered in fur, and seemingly having an appearance similar or like that of a gorilla. It's standing on 2 legs and looks humanoid, but supposedly it also carries these supernatural qualities, mainly that of driving those who witness it insane, very much like the Miniwashitu. Not just that, the Takuhi is known to be extremely aggressive, attacking people who witness it, and on many an occasion being seen dragging dead animals. One of the main sightings of the creature was in 1977, when a film crew was near the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, and at first sighted large footprints in the forest, and slowly after that, accounts came of a large, big hairy man within the forest. Supposedly, one of the people who witnessed him had been driven to a seizure. There's also the claims that around 1977, a lot of cattle mutilation in North Dakota was attributed to the Takuhi, as well as the strange UFO sightings. People just believe the two are linked, with no clear evidence. Devil's Lake Monster. Within North Dakota, there's a lake known as Devil Lake, which has a different name in the Lakota language, which roughly translates to the Lake of Spirits. Within this lake is said to reside an 80-foot-long sea serpent with glowing red eyes and the jaws of an alligator. It's said that the sun reflects in its eyes a bright red, and that you could see it swimming by following the red light that shines off its eyes. The sea serpent is supposed to be green in color, has several fins on either side, and horns seem to be sticking out of its jaws. Since Devil's Lake doesn't connect to any body of water, many people believe that the Devil Lake monster was frozen inside a glacier, and when that glacier melted and became Devil's Lake monster awoke. There have been a lot of reported sightings over the years, many of which made it to the newspapers. Some simple tales of fishermen hooking the monster and seeing it thrash in the water, others sightings by crowds of it sticking its head out of the lake and swimming around, with sightings of the creature starting with the legends from the Lakota tribe of the creature and continuing to this day. Walking Sam. On the border of North and South Dakota is the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. It is said within this reservation, a spiritual being known as Walking Sam stalks those who lives in the reservation, being described as a 7-foot tall being with eyes but no mouth and wears a stovepipe hat. He's also nicknamed the Tall Man or the Stovepipe Hat Bigfoot. Once again, as with most of these North Dakota cryptids, it seems the supernatural powers of the creature is what's truly frightening, as it said that Walking Sam has some sort of aura that causes people despair and slowly drives them to commit suicide. At one point, it even being said that he caused a rash of suicides in the Standing Rock Indian Reservation as well as the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. It's even believed that Walking Sam managed to cause a Bigfoot to kill itself or was killed by Walking Sam. It said when Walking Sam's victims has passed away, he collects their souls. The Lost Bridge Hoofman. The Lost Bridge, built in the 1930s, is next to the town of Killdeer. Many people from this town have a story. No one quite knows why the supernatural ring once haunted the Lost Bridge, but it was said before the Lost Bridge was dismantled in 1994 that if you drove at night on the Lost Bridge, that sometimes you might encounter the Hoofman, a shadowy figure who had hoof for feet, and you would see him walk across the road. That's really all there was to the story. From what I've read, it's never seemed to interact with those who were driving the cars. It would just appear and disappear. As I said earlier, the Lost Bridge was dismantled in 1994, but there is a memorial site for it, and supposedly, the Hoofman now haunts that memorial site. Bigfoot. I mean, he's all over the United States. Of course, he's in North Dakota. When it comes to officially reported sightings, from the BFRO, there's only 3, and it's basically just people seeing Bigfoot running across a field and whatnot. The earliest reported sighting of Bigfoot happened in 1962, happening near the town of Minot. 2 friends were walking back to their home at a trailer park. When they felt like they were being watched, they glanced around and they basically saw Bigfoot. And as the Bigfoot noticed that it was now being observed, it began chasing the 2 and they ran all the way back home. One of the more famous Bigfoot encounters happened on February 2004, in which there would be 4 different sightings of Bigfoot, all within Montreal County. Some of these sightings were people just finding tracks of a very large bipedal animal. Others were direct observations. One of the more disturbing sightings is when a bunch of kids were in their trailer and they noticed a Bigfoot. Supposedly the Bigfoot got really mad, began screeching and running at the trailer, causing a mother to come out and see what's going on, witnessing the Bigfoot. This scaring her and her own children as well as the other children from the trailer that Bigfoot rushed at. Lake Sakakawea Mermaid. It said that long before the Garrison Dam was built in North Dakota, there was a mermaid and her lover who once swam the Missouri River all the way up and down. But when the Garrison Dam was built in 1956, she would end up being separated from her lover and ended up living in the lake known as Lake Sakakawea. Supposedly, she now stays at the deepest part of the lake, hoping to one day be back with her lover. Another part of her tale is supposedly that if you catch her singing on moonlit nights, you might get blessed, and doing so will bring you massive amounts of luck and save you from the wrath of Lake Sakakawea. The Rougarou. Much like the Loup-Garou from Louisiana and all that Cajun lore, the Rougarou is basically the same thing. It's just the French this time came from the north down into North Dakota. As far as I could find, it is literally the same thing where, if you get cursed by a witch, you basically become a werewolf, or if you break your promise during Lent, you become a werewolf. The only way to get rid of it is to transfer it to someone else by biting human flesh. and it's basically a curse where someone turns into this giant wolf-like being and has an insatiable appetite for human flesh. Except this time it's in North Dakota instead of Louisiana. Tier 2. The Gorman Dogfight. This happened in 1948 and is considered one of the earliest UFO cases in all of US history, and one of the very early ones that first made the US military think about the threats of UFOs. On October 1st, 1948, Lieutenant George F. Gorman was flying over Fargo at nighttime, trying to get them nighttime flying hours, when the tower told him only one other plane was in the air with him. Upon observing that plane, he noticed something. Something was following the plane, a strange light. Gorman would call to the tower, saying, "Hey, are you sure it's just us two?" Tower basically says yeah. So Gorman tells him what he saw, flies down, and describes this. It was about 6 to 8 inches in diameter, clear white, completely round, without fuzz at the edges. Now, he was flying an F-51, and the object was flying faster than his F-51 could keep up with. Now, some really intricate air maneuvers start occurring, where the object goes left, he tries to follow, he can't keep up, so he tries cutting it off. It goes right, he has to go right again. There's just a lot of intricate movements going on in the air. This basically leads to both of them going at each other, but then Gorman ends up diving down, not wanting to actually crash with the object. After that, another brief chase occurs, where eventually they both end up running at each other again, but this time the object ends up flying straight up, just before the moment of impact. Gorman tries to chase after, but he ends up not being able to, because he can't go straight up, because eventually he would start stalling, and that's what ends up happening. His plane ends up starting to stall, so he has to let the object go and give up on the chase. The dogfight would last around 27 minutes and absolutely shook Gorman, causing him to have trouble when he was landing his plane back down. More importantly, Gorman wasn't actually the only witness to this event. The person in the control tower who he was communicating with had binoculars on and actually had witnessed both Gorman and the object going at each other. Some other things to note of the UFO that Gorman said: it seemed to have no source of propulsion and made no sounds whatsoever. After he landed and told his story, US military officers investigated his plane. They brought a Geiger counter and found that his plane was measurably more radioactive than other planes that had flown in the area. Just a side note, the information was classified, but Lieutenant Gorman and his commanding officer decided to release it to the public. The Minot Air Force Base UFO sightings. So there's actually 2 UFO sightings in regards to the Minot Air Force Base, one happening in September 1966 and another happening in October 1968. I'll start with the 1966 one first. The first sighting in 66 was simply a UFO flying into a field of nuclear-tipped missiles and causing them to become unlaunchable because it was above them. And obviously, as the UFO was hovering over the missile field, people were coming out and witnessing it. Just seeing it there, hover over the field, flying. People described it as having bright flashing lights, and this occurred at nighttime. As I said earlier, the article where I found it says a lot of people in the base saw it, but what ended up happening, those above everyone, the Air Force officials, would end up telling anyone who saw the object not to speak of it, and that whatever happened did not happen. And that was basically it for 1966. Now onto the other sighting in 68, happening on October 24th. Once again, just around the Minot Air Force Base, a man stationed at the Minutemen Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Complex would observe on radar and in person a UFO, and then eventually 2 UFOs. He would get in contact with someone who was flying a B-52 around the area and basically asked him if they can observe what he's seeing and what he's picking up on radar, and the B-52 itself would also pick up the object on the radar. Once it picked it up, it began following the object. As I said, initially 1 UFO was observed and then a second one was observed after that. What ended up happening was the second one basically trailed the B-52 for about 20 miles, and the B-52 knew this, it saw it on its radar, but again, after 20 miles, the UFO just sort of disappeared. After that, the B-52 was communicating with the person who initially saw the UFOs and was basically told, hey, can you see the one that's hovering down here? Which they did get visual contact with and described it as a large illuminated UFO. What seemed really strange was that whenever the B-52 was near the UFO, it wasn't able to transmit its radios. The observation was said to have lasted about 3 hours. The B-52 would eventually just land in the base, the base would go into lockdown and the UFOs disappeared. John Salter, former University of North Dakota professor, who was actually the first person ever to receive the Martin Luther King Jr. Award from North Dakota. The reason I'm talking about him is because in the 1980s, John Salter would claim to have 2 encounters with a UFO, though they did happen out of North Dakota, but that would lead him to joining the North Dakota chapter of MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. Because at the time he was still a professor and teaching, he would often tell students about his experience in class and even offered UFO courses, which a lot of people took an interest in. He would later in life change his name to Hunter Gray and would pass away in 2019. John Salter, or Hunter Gray, would describe his abduction experience as a medical exam. Tappen Alien Encounters. In the town of Tappen, North Dakota, a family who owns a farm has witnessed UFOs, and one of the members of the family even had an encounter with aliens. This happened in 2006, happening over several months. The first encounter was when a family member was driving their neighbor. While they were driving, looking out the window, they noticed something, a strange object, flying faster than they believed was possible, with strange lights. It quickly went out of view. Several months later, another member of the family and their dog was walking the property when, all of a sudden, they noticed something, a strange craft that seemed to be beaming light into a watering hole. Both the dog and the family member stood still as they seemed not to be able to move. Eventually, the dog started chasing after the object, which caused it to fly off, causing a sonic boom, waking up another member of the family. That's when the person who was frozen realized they could move. And the last encounter happened to one of the sons in the family. One day, on September 12, 2006, the son woke up early in the morning and was getting a glass of water. That's when he heard something messing with the pigs, so he grabbed his gun thinking it was going to be a coyote and went out, getting ready to scare off the animal, or shoot it. That's where he witnessed something else. He would claim to see 8 to 9 feet tall aliens trying to drag a hog off. He shot at one of them, and it screamed loudly, causing the other to rush the boy and pick him up and knock him into the ground, causing him to pass out. When the kid woke up, the pig, which was pregnant, was missing, and he called his family, which called the sheriff, claiming that someone stole their pig, but no evidence of anything could be found. Later, a hypnotist would come down and try to make the boy recall the events of what he saw. He would describe seeing 5 entities enter the corral, and 2 were dragging the pig, who was already dead. The 1966 Gwinner UFO sighting. On September 13, 1966, a boy was waiting for his school bus just outside his home. This boy, Randy E. Rottenberger, would see a UFO, describing it like 2 bulls put together, having 3 pegs at the bottom, green and red lights at the bottom, and antennas sticking out from the top, just slightly hovering above the ground. This frightened him so much he ran back into his home, screaming for his mom, who told him to stay inside the house. After a little bit, he would look outside his window and see the UFO taking off. The next day, him and his friends would go over to where it was, and they would see something. They would see burn marks and depressions into the ground. The depressions went several inches into the ground, and there was at least 20 feet of space between each depression. Many people would come over and see the evidence and claim it to be suspicious, but no one really knew what it proved. A general from the Air National Guard base in Fagro, North Dakota, believed it to be ball lightning, but officials with the Air Force disagreed because there were depressions, so it clearly was a UFO. North Dakota UFO stats. Ranking 37th out of the 50th states for most UFO sightings, with at least 33 for every 100,000 people reporting a UFO sighting, and the National UFO Reporting Center only having 279 cases for the state. This is one of the states that don't have a lot of UFO cases, and you could probably tell by the amount of entries in the Iceberg. 1975 Meccano Mummy Alien Encounter. August 26, 1975, 3 people would be inside a car. Sandra Larson, her boyfriend, and her daughter, Jackie. On the way to Bismarck, something strange would happen. Orange orbs would come down from the sky and make the car stop. Not just the car, but all 3 individuals as well, and faster than a blink of an eye. Sandra, who had been driving, was now in the back seat, and her daughter, Jackie, was now in the front. Extremely confused, they drove to a gas station, only to find out that it was an hour later than what they thought it was. Realizing that they lost time, and that they had a possible encounter with a UFO, Sandra and Jackie would undergo hypnosis to recall the memories. This is when we learn of the Meccano mummy alien. It's called the Meccano mummy because its face was covered in wraps like a mummy. Its hands were described to be like the Meccano toys. That's where the Meccano part of the name comes from. And also, its body was covered in a strange brown vinyl. While under hypnosis, the two would remember several things. Firstly, they were beamed up into the UFO, and that both had their bodies undergo evaluations, some of which involved being rubbed with a clear liquid, taking scrapings from inside their noses. And it also did something with Sandra's brain, as she remembers feeling like her brain was removed from her skull. A further hypnosis session would uncover a hidden memory from Sandra that the alien had in fact visited her when she was younger. Tier 3. Absaraka Church. This church is said to be the home of a strange paranormal phenomenon. Legend goes that something known as the Absaraka lights, or the glowing cross, happens within the church, which, if you couldn't guess or don't know, is when the cross within the church suddenly just starts glowing bright out of nowhere with no apparent source of power or anything, making it a supernatural occurrence. It's said that the glowing cross appears at night, and that whatever direction you're facing, the cross will always appear to you, facing towards you. Even if another person is with you and they're viewing it perpendicular to you, to them it will still be facing towards them. Secondly, while the glowing cross does appear within the church, the only way to view it is through the outside, through the windows, as going inside you will no longer be able to see the glowing cross. Thirdly, it's said that the locals very much hate when people go and sneak around at this church, so people should be careful when going out looking for the cross, not to anger the locals. The Liberty Memorial Building, which is supposed to be haunted by a monster known as the Stack Monster, though there hasn't been evidence of its presence since 1981 after a renovation. Supposedly before then, according to many staff and students of the Liberty Memorial Building, many encounters with the Stack Monster occurred. The Stack Monster was supposedly known to take the forms of shadows, make itself known through footsteps, and as well as disembodied voices. Some examples of these voices would be calling people's name at random, or sometimes just coughing. The being that haunts the Liberty Memorial Building is called the Stack Monster. It's simply in reference to the fact that books would be stacked up on each other and there were stacks of books. The Liberty Memorial Building is the oldest building in the Capitol grounds of Bismarck, North Dakota. The legend of White Lady Lane. In the small town of Walhalla, North Dakota, there's a story of a man and a woman. This man was a peddler who was very much interested in getting with the woman. However, the woman would reject his advances. This angering the man would lead him to killing the woman. He wouldn't get away with the murder, and after being caught, tried killing himself 2 different times, both failing. After the young woman's death, several people reported seeing a lady in a white dress near a bridge known as Eddie's Bridge. Those who witnessed the woman claimed it was the same nightgown that the murdered woman wore on the day she died. University of Mary Satanic Rituals. On November 3rd, 1988, the Bismarck Tribune would write of a supposed satanic cult performing rituals in caves near some hills near the University of Mary. What the newspaper specifically refers to is police officers scaring away teenagers from the caves, telling them there was nothing there. Now, whether there was actually a satanic cult within the town of Bismarck is purely speculation and rumor. Supposedly some high school kids went down into the caves because they had believed they saw people doing rituals and came back with supposed evidence, specifically a bottle labeled canine meat, and because at the time many people believed that Satanists were sacrificing dogs, that this must be a satanic ritual and whatnot, and it would scare the whole town and make a bunch of high school and college kids really curious as to what was in the caves. Though, as I said, not much was actually there, and it was all mainly rumor. Totten Trail Inn, part of the Fort Totten State Historic Site, which has been around since 1867. It began as a boarding school for Native American children, but now serves as an inn for any who are staying in North Dakota. Being a building that old, and with much history behind it, many believe the Totten Inn to be a haunted building. As you could have guessed, many people assume that these haunts come from the Native American children who died while this building was still a boarding school. Some of the reported paranormal activity seen by people is shadowy figures at the edge of their vision, objects being pushed and moving on their own, doors opening and closing when no one's around, and lastly, supposed full-body apparitions of ghosts appearing before people, though that is very rare when it happens. The reported activity mainly happens when it's night at the inn, and for the most part, many describe the inn as beautiful during the day. Tagus, North Dakota. one of the many abandoned towns in North Dakota. Tagus itself was first established in the 1900s and mainly remained a small town, but after 1940, the town would start to decay and lose the people living in it. After that, the town would slowly fade away in obscurity. However, one night on Halloween in the 1980s, 300 kids from out of town would suddenly rush into the town, hoping to have some big Halloween party. The sheriff was made aware of the kids' plans and stopped it just in time, but some kids still got through, and Tagus would be trashed by that small group of kids. Later on in 2001, something disturbing would happen. A group of random people would burn down the last remaining church within Tagus. Just before this, rumors began circulating that the church was now in fact a satanic temple. Rumors of an upside-down cross painted on the walls of the church outside made people believe this, and since the church was now burned down, the rumors just grew more and more. With these rumors came other urban legends, that of hellhounds guarding the area where the church once stood, as well as gravestones that, for whatever reason, glow late in the night, and the other is that supposedly, where the church once stood, now remains a stairway down to hell. Some other supposed paranormal activity within Tagus is a ghost train that supposedly runs down on the old train tracks through Tagus. People think it's a ghost train because it's a translucent train, and of course the usual ghost activity of strange sounds, disembodied voices, and things moving despite no one being in the area where the object was moved. Pyramid Hill / Fort Ransom. Now this one doesn't seem to have any paranormal activity, rather there's this theory that this hill in North Dakota is shaped too much like a pyramid to be a natural structure, despite many scientists saying that it is in fact a natural structure, just a normal hill. Well, some believe it to be part of a 100-foot pyramid that was built there by ancient Native Americans who crossed through Russia and Alaska when the ice bridge was still there, and that over time, grass just grew over it. What remains now is a statue on top of the hill, and also a legend by the local Native Americans of it being a wakan, or a powerful place. There's some other strange things nearby as well. Firstly, there's a rock with all these weird writings on it. But scientists say that this was just caused by, glaciers moving, ice melting, and left all these carvings in the rocks. Others argue that it might in fact be a form of writing that was left behind by ancient Native Americans. A smaller group of those people actually say Vikings came down and might have written all that stuff down. There is another piece of evidence for the Viking theory, and that being a strange rock that seems extremely similar to the things Vikings built. This rock has a hole and a cross in it, with a certain group of people believing it to be a mooring stone. While initially it was believed that the mooring stones were used to anchor Viking boats, that's been disproven, with the current theory being that these stones were actually much bigger and the holes were in fact just a way to destroy the rocks because they were in the way of building farms or some other settlement. Tier 4. The Haven Sanatorium. Originally opening in 1912, with its main mission to help those suffering from tuberculosis, aka the consumption. Remaining open for 75 years, the sanatorium would finally close in 1987. Though throughout the entire time the sanatorium was open, it was not exclusively a hospital for tuberculosis. In around the 40s, when modern medicine started to develop and be able to fight back the disease, rates of TB would decline, and soon, San Haven would become a sanatorium for the developmentally disabled. As always, like many other sanatoriums throughout the US, there was alleged understaffing, which eventually led to the patients of the sanatorium claiming mistreatment and neglect, as well as just the general suffering that the patients were all going through, which supposedly gives the sanatorium, even after its closing, this really dark and gloomy vibe. And even several years after its closing, in 2001, while a 17-year-old boy was exploring the property, he would fall to his death. In 2023, a grant was funded in order to help clean up and demolish the sanatorium. Some claims that people have made about the sanatorium and its haunts include the sound of a baby crying, faces and apparitions appearing in photos and in front of people, dark shadows wandering the halls and running in and out of rooms, as well as supposed orbs of light flying throughout the property. Fort Abercrombie, built in 1858 and initially led by Colonel John J. Abercrombie. The reason for this fort was to help protect the trade post farmers/settlers and travelers from hostile Native Americans as more and more settlers made their way north. This would be the first military outpost in the territory that would later become North Dakota. Being the oldest military outpost in that state, it would see a battle, that of the Dakota War of 1862, when a band of the Sioux tribe would try to siege the fort, in which 4 soldiers were killed and 2 would be wounded. But nearby the fort, 7 years later, the town of Abercrombie would be made, and so the town would preserve the fort. Legends regarding this fort and its haunting tie back to that siege that happened in 1862, with many people claiming to see Sioux Native Americans and even soldiers walking around, seemingly ignoring the people there, and after a while, seemingly get ready for battle. Not just that, but there's a building in the fort called the Blockhouse, where many people claim to feel spirits and have the feeling of being watched, with many people believing that within the fort, that is the most haunted spot, Trollwood. Now, this is a park in North Dakota, which is said to be haunted by apparently what seems to be one ghost. Next to a willow tree, it's said that sometimes you'll see a woman in some sort of gown dancing, but apparently as soon as you take your eyes off her, she'll disappear, and it'll be like she was never there. There's also instances of disembodied voices and being tapped on the shoulder, turning around to find no one is there. Now, many people believe that the reason Trollwood is haunted by this one ghost is due to its history. See, it was initially many different things. Firstly, a farm for poor people to work, but eventually the farm closed down. Later, that farm became a hospital, and after that, the hospital was also shut down. After the hospital was shut down, that specific plot of land Trollwood was on became a cemetery, specifically a cemetery for those who couldn't afford to go to the fancier cemeteries. It was said to hold about 300 graves, and in 1985, a vote was made to move everyone from that cemetery to another site, but it would appear that one grave was missed, as by the willow tree where the ghost is said to appear is said to be a gravestone of a woman. And not just that, but all around Trollwood, if you look close enough, you could see what remains of the cemetery. St. Joseph's Hospital. While there isn't much history that let us know why the hospital itself might be haunted, it's best to simply assume because it is a hospital, some sort of tragedy and all the patient suffering has led the hospital to be haunted, and there's enough paranormal activity to back up the haunting claim. Firstly, it's said that the elevator will randomly just go down to the morgue and open even though no one's riding the elevator or called it down. Secondly, to enter the morgue you need an access key, yet somehow the door will randomly open on its own, despite no one being around. Another thing nurses claim that happens in the hospital is that on the 3rd floor, in one specific room, the nurse call button is often pressed, with someone always going to check in and finding the room empty. Riverside Cemetery, within the city of Fargo, is said to be the most haunted cemetery in all of North Dakota. The reason for this claim is one specific mausoleum that is said if you go on top with a recording device, without fail, you will record the sounds of someone knocking from within the mausoleum, despite the fact that it's supposed to be empty. Not just that, but it is also reported that there are strange sounds all over the cemetery, which just as easily can be recorded. The North Dakota State University. When it comes to the North Dakota State University within Fargo, there's 2 specific haunts. The first happens in the building known as the Ceres Hall, and specifically the 3rd floor of the building, where it is said during World War II, a man hung himself from the heating pipes. Now, while it is acknowledged that the 3rd floor seems to be haunted, within the Ceres Hall, they say that the basement itself is the much more darker and paranormally active area of the hall, which is where more people report seeing and hearing things. The other haunt is that of Minot Hall, in which in the 1920s, in the 4th floor of the Minot Hall, 2 people's bodies would be found. Both people had died. No one knows what happened. It was assumed it was a double homicide. Later on, that floor, which used to be a dance hall, was closed and turned into a zoology lab, but soon the entire 4th floor was closed down due to instability. Ever since it was closed down due to instability, people had snuck in the night, and it goes that everyone who snuck in came back with tales of feeling a strange presence, and like something was watching them the entire time they were in the 4th floor. Fort Abraham Lincoln State Park. Being established in 1872, it would be the fort where Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer set off before being defeated in the Battle of Little Bighorn, as well as during World War II, becoming a Japanese internment camp. One of the many reasons people believe the state park specifically the fort, to be haunted is when buildings and graves were reconstructed of the fallen soldiers from the Battle of Little Bighorn. For whatever reason, people believe that when the things were rebuilt, the spirits came back with them. Now, many people believe that the Custer house that was rebuilt is now haunted by George A. Custer and his wife, Libby, with many people reporting to hear noises, whispers, and footsteps seemingly coming from nowhere, as well as a woman in a black dress staring out of a second-story window, with many believing that to be Libby. Within the fort itself specifically, people say they hear the sounds of crying and feet stomping, despite the fact that when the source of the sound is located, no one is there. Tier 5. Hazel Miner, aka Center Angel of the Prairie. In 1920, a large portion of the north of America was suffering from the spring blizzard of 1920. In a town known as Center in North Dakota, a woman would end up giving her life trying to protect her younger siblings. This woman was Hazel Miner. She would end up protecting her younger brother and younger sister. What ended up happening was the Miner siblings, all three of them, usually took a carriage from their house to the school. This time, the school let them out early because of the blizzard, so they ended up waiting for the dad to come and pick them up with horse and carriage. When the dad showed up, they all got ready to go, but the dad decided to get one more horse that was already at the school. While this was happening, the horses got freaked out because of the blizzard and kind of ended up just walking away, and Hazel had no way to stop them, so she simply tried her best to navigate through the blizzard. Eventually, they would constantly hit hole after hole, be stopped by trees, and it was extremely difficult to traverse through the blizzard. Eventually, the sleigh tipped over and they had no way of flipping it up, so what Hazel did was lay down a blanket, told the two younger siblings to lay above it, and put another blanket over them, and then cuddled with them to keep them warm. By this point, Hazel had already fallen through a waist-deep amount of snow and was already probably suffering from hypothermia. The father, when he came back with the horse and saw that the carriage was gone, had gone to phone up neighbors and began a search and rescue for the children. It would take the search party 25 hours to find the children, and when they did, they had found Hazel over them, keeping them warm. But by that time, she had already passed away. For her sacrifice, she would become a folk hero, and a song would even be made about her. The song was called Much to Share, and was made by folk artist Chuck Suchey. And as I said at the beginning of the video, she would become known as the Center Angel of the Prairie. The 1957 Fagro Tornado. On June 20th, 1957, the storm cell would cause 5 tornadoes to land within North Dakota. This storm cell lasted 6 hours, and the 5 tornadoes that were created were the Wheatland Tornado, the Castleton Tornado, the Fagro Tornado, the Glendon Tornado, and the Dell Tornado. The third one, the Fagro Tornado, would end up being the most devastating tornado, being considered an F5 tornado, meaning that it reached wind gusts of over 200 miles per hour. Would destroy 5 blocks worth of property in Fagro, damaging over 1,000 homes and destroying 340. This tornado would end up causing 13 casualties and injured around 103 different people. The Fagro tornado traveled along a 9-mile-long path and was approximately 700 feet wide. 1941 blizzard. On March 5th, 1941, a blizzard would strike Minnesota and North Dakota with very little warning, putting hundreds of people at risk of injury and harm. In total, this blizzard would kill 151, with 39 people in eastern North Dakota dying, which is where the blizzard hit most severely. The blizzard lasted for about 7 hours, and would cause massive temperature fluctuations, with in some places it dropping 20 degrees in less than 15 minutes. It would cause highways to get shut down while people were still on the highway, as many people would end up being trapped in their cars because of how quickly the blizzard came. Winds would be sustained at 45 miles per hour, but in some places reaching as high as 85 miles per hour or even 75. The 1945 Michigan train wreck. Now, this refers to a town in North Dakota named Michigan. On August 9th, 1945, around 7:20 p.m., the first part of the train, the Great Northern Passenger, had to make an emergency stop. Unfortunately, Section 2 of the Great Northern Passenger was not aware of this and would end up driving straight into the first section of the Great Northern Passenger. In total, 237 people were in the first section, and in the second section, there was about 600 to 700 people. The majority of these were military men and women, this being because World War II was dying down, and in fact, within the week, the treaties would all be signed and the war would be over, so a lot of people were returning home. There was an effort to let the second train know that the first train was stopped, and those who worked at the railroad were signaling it to stop, but it seemed that it was too late, and the second section crashed into the first section, and ultimately 34 people would end up losing their lives in the accident, with a total of 303 being injured. As soon as the wreck happened, those who had survived and were fine immediately started helping to pull people in the wreckage out, and also thankfully some welders had just gotten finished with their job. As soon as they saw the wreck, they got all their tools out and began trying to help people out as well, thankfully saving a lot of people. The reason the train stopped for an emergency was because a wheel bearing on the train had fully burnt out, which meant that the train could no longer move, and the second section of the train was aware of this and had in fact slowed down. But unfortunately, by the time the first section of the train stopped, the second section began speeding back up again, and only managed to slow down to about 30 miles per hour before the impact occurred. The Red River Flood in April 1997, which borders North Dakota and Minnesota, would begin the flood. This would affect many cities such as Fargo, North Dakota, Moorhead, Minnesota, Grand Forks, North Dakota, and East Grand Forks, Minnesota. While the flooding did not cause any fatalities, in total, it would cost at least $3.5 billion worth of damages. While some cities were able to survive the flooding, such as Fargo, other cities would not be so lucky, having whole towns flooded, forcing an evacuation of at least 50,000 people, and causing a fire that would burn 11 buildings and 60 apartment units. In Fargo, the Red River would crest 39.5 feet, but unfortunately, in Grand Fork, the river would end up cresting at 54.35 feet. The reason for the river's flooding seems to be rain and snow, as rain filled the river up with a lot of water. And after a very harsh winter with a lot of ice, when the ice started melting, more water entered the river system, which is what would begin the flooding. The 1920 North Dakota blizzard. On March 15th, a blizzard that would end up killing 34 people, one of which was Hazel Miner, would strike North Dakota. Beginning on March 15th and lasting all the way through the 18th, it would bring at least 8 inches of snowfall, halt the railroads in Bismarck, North Dakota, and ended up bringing severe winds and blinding visibility. Tier 6. The U.S. Dakota War of 1862. Now, while this is mainly a thing that affects Minnesota, and at the time North and South Dakota weren't even states, the ramifications of this war would later affect the state of North Dakota. This war, also known as the Sioux Uprising or the Dakota Conflict, was about a band of Dakota Native Americans, known as the Santee Sioux. Again, a large portion of this conflict happens in Minnesota. It's just called the Dakota War after the Native American tribe of people, the Dakota. Basically, as white settlers encroached on more and more Native American land, Native American people would start getting very mad and hostilities between the two people would rise, this eventually leading to an attack by several Native Americans on white settlers. These Native Americans basically ended up going back to the tribe saying, enough is enough, we need to start a war, and the Dakota War of 1862 would officially start on August 17, 1862, with an attack led by Chief Little Crow on the Lower Sioux Agency, which is where a lot of white settlers were settling, by the Minnesota River Valley. The attack on the Lower Sioux Agency happened during the night and would continue until August 18th during the day, and basically a lot of white civilian people would end up being murdered by the Native Americans. A volunteer infantry regiment would be sent in order to quell the attack, and they eventually would, but at the cost of a lot of men, approximately 24, repeated a decent amount of times. A large portion of this war happened within Minnesota, with several more skirmishes happening, this even spilling into the Dakota territories. As I mentioned earlier in another entry, Fort Abercrombie was involved in one of these battles. This would all lead to the Battle of Wood Lake on September 23, 1862, which would be the battle to end the Dakota War. And basically what had happened at this point was, because of the Civil War, Minnesota did not have the troop count to actually suppress this war. And basically at this point they had finally gotten some troops back from the Civil War. And with that big number advantage, they were able to properly face the Sioux Uprising. Seeing this, a peace treaty would shortly be signed, hostages would end up being exchanged, and many of the Dakota men who were afraid for the crimes they committed would end up running to the Dakota territories and settling there. Now, while the total numbers of actual casualties within the entire war itself aren't 100% known, there have been estimations made where I've seen from around 500 to 600 United States citizens being killed, a majority of those being civilian, with it being said less than 100 were U.S. Army volunteers or in the Army at the time. And on the Dakota side of casualties, it's even less known how many people were lost. It's assumed about 100 died on that final battle, and it is known that 38 were executed. 303 men were convicted and sentenced to death after the war, but President Lincoln ended up commuting the sentences of a majority of these men except for 38, which would actually lead to America's largest mass execution ever. The war would officially come to an end on September 26, 1862, and the men who had been sentenced to death would be executed on December 26, 1862. Battle of the Badlands, occurring August 7, 1864, and lasting all the way to the 9th. This was over 2 days of skirmishes between the United States Army and 3 different tribes, the Lakota, Yanktonai, and the Dakota. Basically, following the Dakota War of 1862, the US government still believed more punishment should be done to the Native Americans, and so started pursuing them eastward into Dakota itself, and even pushing all the way towards Montana, but we're here for North Dakota. And so this battle occurred within what would later be the North Dakota Territory, in between the towns known now as Medora and Sentinel Blue. In this conflict, the US Army would come out victorious, having a far larger attack force, the National Park Service claiming that within this battle, 100 Native American warriors were killed, and the US Army would only suffer 9 dead and about 100 wounded. The objective of the US Army, which was led by Alfred Sully, was to make it through the Badlands to keep pursuing more Sioux and Dakota Native Americans, which is what they ended up successfully doing. This battle isn't even really described as a battle, it's more like the Native Americans were doing their best to slow down the army rather than engaging on face-to-face attacks, but ultimately the US Army would see through the Badlands. So, the Battle of Killdeer Mountain on July 28, 1864. Once again, Alfred Sully, in pursuit of Native Americans in response to the Dakota War of 1862, would end up encountering a large encampment of Native Americans. Seeing as he was at war with them, he would ready his men and would make his presence known to the encampment, walking up to it and it being described as a mile-long wide worth of troops. They also had cannons aimed at the encampment. It is reported that within the encampment there were about 5,000 to 6,000 Native American warriors, and on the US's side, about 2,200 troops. One of the stranger things I've read while reading about these battles was the fact that on the initial encounter between the two troops, they did not immediately engage with each other. Rather, the Native Americans sent someone out, but did not provoke an attack. They just sort of had a standoff. This drove one of the majors on the US Army side pretty mad, and basically just ordered for the attack to begin. The Sioux Native Americans would hold their own for a good while within the battle, but after a while, due to the sustained gunfire and the barrage of cannons, the US Army would break through and be victorious in the battle, with a total estimated 46 casualties, 15 coming from the US and 31 coming from the Sioux Native Americans. The Battle of Whitestone Hill. On September 3, 1863, Army forces, led by General Alfred Scully, were making their way through North Dakota to attack Sioux Native Americans in response to the Dakota War of 1862. His troops would end up finding an encampment of several different Native Americans. The troops were reconnaissance troops, and they would make their way back to the main force in order to let the main force know where their next engagement would be. Several of the Native Americans became aware of the reconnaissance, and so many fled, while others came out to meet the general and try to broker a peace treaty, offering several of their chiefs if they weren't attacked. However, the US Army wanted a total surrender, and so the battle commenced. In the end, US Army's overwhelming firepower would lead them to victory. Also, seeing as this encampment was mainly just for living, it didn't have a big defending force. In total, 20 soldiers would end up being killed, with 38 being injured. On the Native American side, it's estimated from 100 to 300 people were killed, many of whom were just regular non-combatants. Tier 7. Ray Dempsey Gardner. Born in Columbus, Ohio in 1922, Ray Dempsey Gardner would go over 3 different states, killing a person in each one, who killed in 1941 and 1949. He first began his murder spree in Jamestown, North Dakota. While in jail, he would strangle his cellmate, but he would get away with it as the people who ran the jail thought that his cellmate had just died of natural causes. His second victim was in Ogden, Utah on July 20th, 1949, where he would trick a 17-year-old Shirley Gretzinger into thinking she was going to do a simple babysitting job, but would instead end up sexually assaulting and killing her before dumping the body in a thicket. In the same year, he went to Montana, where he would look through the newspapers and find an ad for someone looking for a job. This would be a 39-year-old woman named Sue Horn, who he would pick up and drive far away to a secluded place where he would try to rob her. She would attack him and get out of the car, but unfortunately for her, Ray Gardner had a gun and shot her, killing her. Then he would bury the body. Later that year, Ray Gardner would be driving to his place of employment, which was a farm. When he got there, he noticed that the owner of the farm's son was there. For that reason, he decided immediately to get away from the farm, and in doing so, would crash into a trailer, flipping it over, running a stop sign, and a bunch of other illegal driving stuff. Basically, this all leads to the police holding him, going through his car, and finding evidence that tied him to the killing of the woman in Montana. When presented with all this evidence, he would confess to all 3 murders he'd done. He would later try to recant the first 2 murders, but by that time it was too late, and he would be sentenced to death, being executed on September 29, 1951, via firing squad. Henry Layer. On April 22, 1920, the Wolf family would be met by Henry Layer. Henry Layer came to their farm that the dog had bit his cattle. The father, Jacob Wolf, began arguing with John Layer, eventually grabbing a shotgun, loading it, and telling John Layer to get off his land. John Layer didn't listen and grabbed the shotgun. When reaching for it, it went off, hitting Jacob Wolf's wife and a farmhand they had hired, a young boy. Both were shot and killed. As Henry Layer now had the weapon, Jacob Wolf began running, and Henry Layer found more ammo, loaded it, and would proceed to kill 5 other members of the family with the shotgun. He would, for whatever reason, I'm assuming he ran out of ammo, attack one more, Martha Wolf, with a hatchet, killing her. He would actually leave the youngest, a 9-month-old Emma Wolf, by herself, and instead began gathering the bodies and piling them into the pig pen and hiding them. He would leave the farm and leave it as is. Time would pass by, and neighbors would notice that the farm had no movement and that clothes that had been left out was not being brought in, even after it had rained. So neighbors went in to investigate, and they would find the bodies, calling the police shortly thereafter, who came and investigated. Henry Layer would be suspected of killing, but with no solid evidence. He was solely a suspect. People kind of thought it was him simply because the way he reacted to the bodies. He seemed deeply interested into the bodies, opening the caskets of everyone he killed and staring at their faces in front of everyone. Simply put, Henry Layer would be arrested on May 11th because despite no physical evidence, he just kept making himself seem more and more suspicious. For one thing, when the investigators were at the farm after the murder had been reported, Henry Layer came over and told the investigators about how the Wolf's family dog attacked his cattle. And again, I mentioned the way he acted at the funeral. The police just had no one else to go to, so they went to him. And just a day after being arrested and questioning him, Henry Layer would confess. He would get life in prison and would remain there for a little under 5 years, as he would die in the state penitentiary in 1925. Charles Bannon. Working as a farmhand for the Haven family, the 22-year-old Charles Bannon would one day, according to himself, would accidentally shoot the oldest boy in the family, Daniel Haven. After this, he would go and massacre the rest of the family, who included Albert Haven, the father, Lulia Haven, the mother, Leland Haven, Daniel's brother, Charles Haven, Daniel's other brother, and Mary Haven, Daniel's younger sister. And the brothers were all younger too. Daniel was the oldest. No one quite knows what specific day they died, but it is assumed to have happened around February 9th, 1930, because after that, the neighbors no longer saw the family, and actually, Charles would take up residence in the farm. He would also invite his father over, and the two resided in the farm, telling neighbors that the Haven family simply decided to up and move, despite the fact that the family had a shop in the farm and the fact that the family had been living on the farm for over 10 years at that point. Eventually, people got suspicious, and it became far more suspicious when Charles suddenly began selling pieces of the land off even though he technically didn't own them, and he would be jailed on grand larceny charges December 1930. While the police were investigating, they went over to the farm, and they would find the bodies of the Haven family. Something to note was the father left shortly before all of this happened, and he would write to Charles, telling him to be careful and watch his step, and also to do what is right, sort of implying that the father knew about the murders and may have helped cover them up. Obviously, because the father lived on the farm at the time the family was murdered and the bodies were at the farm, the police would bring him in, and both Charles and James were held in a jail. But because they were held for different charges, not the murder charges, they would end up having to be transferred to the Schaefer jail, which unfortunately for Charles would be the place he would get taken from and be lynched, as on the night of January 28, 1931, a lynching mob would break into the jail, force the sheriff who was guarding the jail into a jail cell, and take Charles. Charles pleaded with the lynch mob, telling him that his father was innocent and not to hurt him, and so the lynch mob put him in the jail cell with the sheriff and another person who was there just for thievery. The lynch mob, which consisted of about 75 people, dragged Charles all the way back to the Haven residence, but the person who was overseeing the Haven residence actually told him to go away and threatened the lynch mob with a gun. So the lynch mob took him over to Cherry Creek, where a new bridge had just been built, and there they lynched him. If you're wondering what happened to Charles's dad, James Bannon, he would be sent to prison shortly after all of this, and would remain there until he was 76 years old for helping covering up the murder of the Haven family. Eugene Butler. Living in Niagara, North Dakota, Eugene Butler, when growing up, would often be described as a loner, who seemed to spend most of his time avoiding social interaction, and when he was an adult, mainly only talked to those he hired to work on his farm. It would seem that something was wrong with him, as in the last 7 years that he remained alive, he would be sent off to an asylum in Jamestown. This was in 1906. There he would remain until he died in 1913. It wouldn't be until 2 years later, when people were going through his farm, just doing a routine excavation, when something was found, a space beneath the floor. Upon discovering this, the people went down and found bones. They began digging and soon found more bones. In total, they would find enough bones for 5 adults and 1 young man. No one knows how old he was, but it's assumed from 15 to 18 years old. Based off the things Eugene Butler had said before going insane, people believe the reason he killed these people, which many assume were farmhands that he hired, because he believed that they were robbing him. All 5 victims were found with blows to the skull, which is how investigators assume is how he killed all 5 people. Due to how late the bodies were found, not much more can be investigated since it was barely the early 1900s, so there's no way knowing if he kept them alive and tortured them, or simply just killed them on the spot and then buried the bodies. John Carr, aka the Son of Sam conspiracy. So some context to this, if you don't know what the Son of Sam murders were, basically in 1976, the serial killer was going around New York killing people with a .44 special caliber bulldog revolver, and for a while he was known as the .44 killer, but then in a note he would refer to himself as the Son of Sam, and that would be his new name. In this crime spree that lasted about a year, he would end up killing 6 people. In the end, the Son of Sam killer, also known as David Berkowitz, that's his real name, ended up getting caught because he parked his car in a spot for too long and got a parking ticket, and basically he would confess saying that he did all these murders and had no help from anyone. Well, it turns out there's a theory, first created by an investigative journalist named Maury Taylor. He basically posited that it was no way for Berkowitz to have done all the crimes by himself, and he had to have had help from someone. This is where the whole conspiracy theory thing kinda takes shape. Well, in New York, David Berkowitz's neighbor was a man named Sam Carr, and David Berkowitz, when confessing to his crimes, would claim that Sam Carr's Labrador dog had been instructing him to kill. This is something he would try to take back. However, people would take notice of this, and some people believed that Sam Carr had been involved in some way with David Berkowitz. There were some other suspicious things as well, such as David Berkowitz's supposed ties to a satanic cult, and also the fact that when people were describing the Son of Sam killer, the composites that police artists drew weren't always the same, making people believe once again that there was more than one killer. Now, the satanic cult claims come from Berkowitz himself saying that he joined a satanic cult, and he would later name other members of the cult two of these being John and Michael Carr. There were several others. Anyways, if you notice their last name is Carr, their relation to Sam Carr, Berkowitz's neighbor, is that John and Michael are both the children of Sam Carr. Now, just to skip through a bunch of other stuff, Michael Carr would die under suspicious circumstances in New York in a car accident where some people believed it seemed like he was being pushed off the road. But we'll kind of have to fast forward past that since we're tying this to North Dakota. John Carr, the other brother, would end up dying in the Minot Air Force Base in 1978 by committing suicide. As I previously stated, Berkowitz would claim John and Michael were all part of a satanic cult, and that they were all involved in the Son of Sam murders as well. Anyways, this ties to another event that happened in North Dakota, one claimed by Sheriff Deputy Glenn Getson, who claimed one time in Ruthville, a little north of Minot, he would end up encountering a satanic cult who was practicing a black mass. At first, he didn't realize what it was. He thought it was just people who broke into a building and were having a party. He came in, would end up seeing a bunch of miners drinking from a chalice that supposedly had urine and dog remains in it. Now, at the time, Glenn Getson wouldn't make the connection, but a couple days beforehand, it was reported that a church had lost its chalice. Also, Getson would say that when investigating the area, he ended up finding the corpses of many dead dogs, believing them to be sacrificed for the Black Mass. It is believed that John Carr was in North Dakota trying to establish a satanic cult within that area. For what reason, I'm not too sure, but that's what the investigative journalist Maury Terry was trying to figure out, how everyone was connected, who helped David Berkowitz commit murders if they did, and what was their next plan. If you want to know more about Maury Terry's findings, there is a documentary on Netflix, The Sons of Sam, A Descent into Darkness, which goes far more into depth and talks about these events far more and the other members of the cult. So if you're really interested in the subject, I would highly recommend you go and watch this documentary. And if you want to get really into depth, or more into depth, there's a website called thepeopleversusdavidberkowitz.com, and it has a lot of Maury Terry's notes and summarizations of his findings, as well as a bunch of official documents from the government regarding the Son of Sam's investigation. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button if you did enjoy it. If you didn't, let us know why in the comments. Have a good day. Bye.